Look at the events you've written down. Can you see that the conclusion you reached, mistakes and failure are bad, is a valid interpretation of those events? Would you say that many children the same age as you, who had the same experiences as you, would have formed the same conclusion you did? Now we're going to play a little game I like to call possibilities. Well, imagine 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Now, your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, mistakes and failure are bad. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you just didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, Mom and Dad thought mistakes and failure were bad, just like a lot of other people, but they could be wrong. I can think of a lot of scientific breakthroughs, like penicillin, for example, that have come about as the result of mistakes. Couldn't this interpretation explain your childhood events just as well as your interpretation? Mom and Dad thought mistakes and failure were bad, just like a lot of other people, but they could be wrong. Now here's what your second friend says after watching the video of your childhood. Mom and Dad were mad or annoyed because you didn't do what they wanted, or the way they wanted, or when they wanted, not because you made a mistake or failed. Isn't this interpretation just as good as the interpretation you came up with, mistakes and failure are bad? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. Mistakes and failure were considered bad in your family, but that doesn't mean they'd be considered bad in all families. They weren't in Thomas Edison's. We know that Edison tried 1,000 different filaments in the light bulb that didn't work before he finally found one that did work. When asked about this, he said, I've not failed. I've just found 999 ways that won't work. Quite obviously, he considered the first 999 attempts valuable learning experiences, not mistakes or failure. The trial and error involved in all his inventions prove that. Couldn't this interpretation explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation, that mistakes and failure are bad? You see, your childhood interactions with your parents could have lots of meanings. Here's one your fourth friend suggests. Mom and Dad's annoyance wasn't a response to your mistakes and failure. They were just too insecure to let you learn from your mistakes. Friend one is the second suggestion. Perhaps your parents had unreasonable expectations for a child your age. And don't forget, not achieving something isn't necessarily a failure. Michael Jordan, who turned out to be pretty well the greatest basketball player ever, was cut from his varsity basketball team as a sophomore in high school. Is that guy a failure? Friend two has another possibility. Not achieving something isn't automatically a failure. It's part of the learning process. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that mistakes and failure are bad? Of course they can. So do you accept that mistakes and failure are bad is not a fact? It's not the truth, but just a truth? Merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events? Let me repeat the question, and please make sure you answer out loud. Does mistakes and failure are bad now seem like it's not the truth, but just a truth? Another way of saying this is, do you get that this belief is just one interpretation of many possible interpretations of the events we discussed earlier? Feel free to pause the program so you can read over the interpretations if you'd like. With a little help from me and from your friends, it's now clear that your parents' reaction to you after you didn't do what they wanted you to do could have at least 6 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, mistakes and failure are bad? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Take a few moments and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to the formation of the belief mistakes and failure are bad. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see mistakes and failure are bad in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief mistakes and failure are bad, you probably did feel it. I'll say more about the feeling in a minute, but what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. Didn't it seem as if you could see mistakes and failure are bad, as if it were out there in the world? Here's why we usually think we can see our beliefs. What happened was that you looked at events that could have had many different meanings and chose one, which was mistakes and failure are bad. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You attributed the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Look at the lemon on the screen. Can you see the lemon without seeing the yellow? No, the color is inseparable from the actual object. You can't see one without seeing the other. Even imagining the lemon will cause you to imagine the color yellow. It's the same when you attribute a meaning to an event. Once you do, seeing the event is the same as seeing its meaning for you. Right now, imagine being a little child and seeing Mom and Dad's behavior and expression and hearing their words and tone of voice. As you imagine it, right now as a little child, doesn't it seem as if you can see mistakes and failure are bad? It does, doesn't it? But did you really see mistakes and failure are bad? Before you answer, here's what I mean by seeing something. You can see the computer you're using now, right? What color is it? What shape is it? Where is it? Isn't it true that anything you can see can be described by shape, color, and location? You answered yes out loud, didn't you? Well then, what did mistakes and failure are bad look like when you were a child? What color was it? What shape was it? Where was it? Did you ever really see mistakes and failure are bad? Can you even see bad? Yes, I know you saw Mom and Dad's behavior when they were annoyed with you, and you heard them criticize you. Anyone could have seen that. But you just realized that what you saw and heard could have many different meanings in addition to the one you gave the events, which was mistakes and failure are bad. You may respond, Mom and Dad said mistakes and failure are bad. I heard them say it. You may have heard them say it, but you never heard that it was true. One interpretation of their statement is they were right. Another interpretation is they are wrong. It's clear that anything you can see, like a person or an object, can be physically described. So if you can't physically describe what mistakes and failure are bad looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Now, if you never really saw mistakes and failure are bad, what did you see? Imagine being a little kid again, and tell me what you're seeing right now. Is it clear that all you really saw was the reaction of one or both of your parents when you did something? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events, right? I heard you say yes, didn't I? Remember what I pointed out a few minutes ago. What happened was that you looked at a series of events which can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was mistakes and failure are bad. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you attributed the meaning to the events. Can you get that they had no meaning before you gave them one? I'm going to make an important distinction between consequences and meaning. There clearly were consequences to your parents' behavior. You got yelled at or punished, or your parents didn't talk to you. That was an unpleasant consequence. But was there any meaning to their behavior? Let me explain what I mean by meaning. Imagine you're in a room and someone you know comes in and doesn't speak to you. What might you automatically think? For example, you might have just said, they're mad at me. or they're being rude, or they had something on their mind and didn't notice me. Notice, however, that what you just said is the meaning you gave to the event. And where did the meaning you just gave their behavior come from? That's right, your mind. Meaning is in your mind, yes? So if meaning is in your mind, is there any meaning inherent in your parents' behavior, or any other events for that matter? Of course, the answer is no. So it's not that what happened to you as a child didn't matter. It just has no meaning. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you attributed one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying that you don't know anything for sure about you, about other people, or about life as a result of these experiences. What do I know for sure about mistakes and failure from knowing how your parents treated you when you were a child? Nothing. And if I don't know anything, then you don't either. Now finally, if you never saw mistakes and failure are bad out there in the world, where has it been